I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we begin this edition of the program, I'd like to remind you that you can support the work here I do at Parallax Views by donating to my Patreon page at patreon.com/parallaxviews. This show is entirely listener-funded, no corporate sponsors. So, I need your help to keep this show going. Please donate to patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, I'm pleased to announce that on this edition of the program, we have a returning guest, veteran journalist William Dowell, who has covered everything from the Iranian Revolution to the transition of popes, which is apropos because we're going to be discussing the passing of Pope Francis on this edition of Parallax Views, and why William Dowell considered Pope Francis to be a rather important pope in our lifetime, one that reflected the spiritual values and core tenets of Christ. This conversation will also open up into broader areas as we discuss how to confront authoritarianism in our time. All that and much more on this edition of Parallax Views. By the way, William wrote an obituary for Pope Francis at the website WhoWhatWhy. You can read that by heading over to whowhatwhy.org, or you will find a link to that obituary in the episode synopsis. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with William Dowell. Welcome back to Parallax Views. William Dowell, who is the editor for international coverage at WhoWhatWhy. He previously worked for NBC and ABC News in Paris before signing on as a staff correspondent for Time magazine based in Cairo, Egypt. He has led a very storied life covering the war in Vietnam, the revolution in Iran, the civil war in Beirut, and so much more, even Afghanistan, I believe. And we're going to be talking about a piece he wrote in WhoWhatWhy entitled The Passing of a Genuinely Christian Pope. Yes, we are talking about the passing of Pope Francis. How are you doing, William Dowell, and what led you to write this article?
Well, it's my job.
Well, that's fair.
But
it seemed like you were genuinely moved by this Pope, though, in a way that was interesting.
I was. He definitely was one of the finest popes to come along in recent times. But I actually covered, I was working for ABC News out of Paris in the 1970s. And I covered the funeral of Pope Paul VI. And I am not a Catholic or particularly religious. And the Pope's body had been badly embalmed. And so a gang of journalists, a gaggle of journalists, I guess, was following the body around the different palaces in Rome for the funeral. And the body began to smell. And so the Vatican put up fans to blow the air away and everything. And journalists were becoming increasingly cynical about the Pope and everything in his passing. Nobody, of course, realized or spent much time talking about what the Pope had actually done. And then I was standing on the colonnades looking down on St. Peter's Square when the final moments of the funeral came. And there must have been 300,000 people in the square, and all of the world's major leaders and everything. And somebody read the will of the Pope. And Pope Paul said, "To Rome I leave my heart. I've always loved you," you know. And then he went on to say all of the things that he had accomplished. And Paul VI had ended the Second Vatican Council, which had decided to change the Mass from Latin, which nobody understood, to vernacular local languages and everything. And that had caused a tremendous uproar and infighting within the church and everything. And I thought, here's a man who held this 1.4 billion Catholic, assembly together through these tumultuous times. And this was no small achievement. And as I looked down on the plaza, a sudden applause rose spontaneously, and everybody realized this was the last time they were going to see this Pope, and then he would be gone forever. They'd have lost him. And I was really moved by that. It was one of the most moving experiences of my journalistic career. And that's something I never forgot. And I think Pope Francis is in a similar way. He has expanded the church beyond Rome. He's the first pope since 731 AD who is not a European. And the Pope Paul VI had been the first pope since 1809 to actually travel outside of Italy. So the church moved from being an Italian operation to being a global enterprise, which is what it was supposed to be all along. And I think Francis helped to expand that to include transgender people, homosexuals, to include immigrants and all sorts of people. So he broadened the church and made it much closer to what Jesus originally intended it to be.
One thing I've found interesting is there's been a lot of sort of far-right voices in America, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, just celebrating the death of the Pope. And it's interesting to see conservatives do that because Pope Francis was conservative on a lot of issues. He was anti-pornography. He was pretty conservative on gender issues and gay marriage. And yet you see all these right-wingers like Marjorie Taylor Greene attacking him. It seems like his message of wanting to help the poor and the needy really is at the core of why so much of MAGA just hates this man.
Well, yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene was, I think, raised a Catholic, and then she abandoned the church and went over to whatever she's doing at the moment, which has nothing to do with Christianity or being a Christian, I think. And the problem with the Catholic Church is that it's schizophrenic because there's a teaching of Jesus, which is what the church, claims to be about. But the church is also a political enterprise and involved in political power, and and it's always been a problem because I think that Ayatollah Khomeini actually, whom I also had followed and had spent time with. He said you either choose Islamic rule or Islamic law, meaning that you either follow the Quran or you depart from the Quran and look for political power. The point is that politicians must compromise in order to have power. If you're religious, you cannot compromise with God. And so the two are set against each other. It's impossible to be genuinely religious and be political, at least as far as, unless, as Jesus said, render unto Caesar Caesar's due, render unto God belongs to God. In other words, Jesus could see a difference between political power and your religious duty to God and your duties to society. But Marjorie Taylor Greene clearly doesn't see any of that. In fact, she doesn't. In fact, she's almost a ridiculous person in her contradictions.
It was very interesting. You mentioned Pope John Paul II in your article very briefly, but you said his importance may have been more political than spiritual. And you contrast that to Pope Francis. You believe that his um, importance is more spiritual than political. Can you get into that? What's the difference between the two?
Well, I also followed Pope John Paul II very closely because I was working at the time. I was working for ABC News in Paris, and I became very much involved in the Lech Wałęsa and the Polish struggle to throw off Russian colonialism, basically. And so I was there when John Paul II was elected. In fact, I was standing on the roof of St. Peter's, right next to the smokestack that gives out white smoke when the Pope is elected and black smoke is not. And I was standing next to the Vatican radio correspondent who was inside a booth and was looking through a smoke glass window. So when the white smoke came up, he didn't see it. So it was a mini scoop, let's say, in radio that I was the first one to call the election of John Paul II. But after that, I covered solidarity and the movement of the Wałęsa to try to liberate Poland from basically from Russia. And John Paul II was just extremely important. He was the spiritual force in that case, bringing the Poles together and giving them the strength to throw off Moscow. And I said that Pope Paul VI, when this applause was one of the great moments of my life, one of the second great moments was I was in the Gdansk shipyards when Lech Wałęsa arrived, and there must have been several 100,000 people in the shipyards, and the crowds separated as Wałęsa entered the shipyard, and he was there to accept the submission of the Communist Party. In fact, the Communist Party was surrendering to the workers' movement. And as he walked through the crowd, all of the ships in Gdansk harbor sounded their sirens at the same moment. So I knew at that time that communism was finished in Poland, at least. And the third moment was I was in Tehran when Ayatollah Khomeini arrived, and there were 6 million people at the airport. So those are mass movements of people, sudden in a turning point of history. And I think Pope Francis is a turning point in history, probably not as monumental as those moments, but just as important.
Can you speak more to that? Why do you think he is that turning point in history? And does it have to do with the ways in which he sort of pushes back against the more reactionary forces in the church? Because it seems as if he's trying to promote these basic Christian values that may be in conflict with more political reactionary forces.
Well, what Francis was telling everybody is what Jesus told everybody. Jesus said, the Bible says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God. And Jesus preached that we have to look out for each other. The basic rule of humanity is human decency towards each other, and that we are responsible for what happens to each other. And so Francis returned the church to thinking that. In other words, his predecessors had been for the power of the church, the authority of the church, the infallibility uh, in, the
Infallibility?
impossibility of the yes, right, of the Pope being wrong, which is obviously absurd because the Pope is a human being. Of course, he can be wrong. And so Francis returned the Pope to the thinking of Jesus, I think, and or the role of the Pope to the thinking of Jesus. And I think it had been drifting away from that. And certainly the government we have now, I mean, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, are not Christians, in the sense of Jesus was. I don't know what they're doing, but whatever they're doing, they don't care about the poor. They hate anybody who's different. This whole movement to build a campaign of hate against anybody whose skin isn't, you know, pure white is absolutely against what of course, Jesus wasn't white either. You know, he, I don't know if he was black, but he certainly wasn't. He was from the Middle East, and it was, you know,
Do you want to talk about what did you think of the fact that he, right before dying, he meets with J.D. Vance, which is, interesting. But I think it's also interesting that despite their disagreements, he
well,
agreed to meet with him.
I think it was a generosity on his part. In other words, in the thinking of Jesus, is that no person is really an enemy. Everybody can be understood. And so J.D. Vance has said, I mean, I don't necessarily dislike J.D. Vance. I think that he's somebody who's ruthless. He has no foundation, and he can switch from one side to another. And he went to Yale University Law School. He turned against the universities, and he went back to his hillbilly roots. So he's a soul in search of a foundation, and I think the Pope understood that, and the Pope said, "Well, I won't turn him away. I won't refuse to see him, even if I don't agree, even if I don't agree with what he's saying." And I think one of the analyses of Vance has got a lot of personal problems that he's covered up with politics. But somebody said that what he was really looking for, why he converted to Catholicism, is for order. And so he saw the church as an authority that he could follow, but Pope Francis did not see the church as an authority that he should follow. What he saw was the church was a way to communicate Jesus's teachings to the public. And those teachings are not to be a slave to some authoritarian power. They're just basically to be a human being and to appreciate the value of other human beings.
I wanted to ask you, what do you make of? I mentioned earlier that Pope Francis probably did have some. I mean, I know he had some conservative sort of views, but he still is set apart from, you know, the average, maybe right-wing person. He's not easy to place in the political spectrum. Can you speak to that? What do you make of that?
Well, I think that the problem if you're Pope is that you have to hold this uh, vast assembly of people who have very different points of view together somehow. And that's so it's not a question of being conservative. It's a question of not having the whole thing fly apart because you're too radical or moving too fast or that you don't understand or you're not willing to listen. Abraham Lincoln, initially, the reason Lincoln was elected president is because he was not rabidly anti-slavery. He was
He wanted to keep the Union together.
right, but Seward was a more likely candidate. But Seward was so much of an anti-slavery activist that the South wouldn't vote for him, and he couldn't win the election. So they decided on Lincoln, who was more middle of the road. But then Lincoln turned against slavery, and he was able to take the country with him. And that's a little bit what the Pope tries to do, is to to listen to people and maybe not to be AOC or somebody who's, radically just going to do it all instantaneously, but to gently guide people in the right direction.
You've covered a lot of religious institutions or sort of intersections between politics and religion. You mentioned covering the death of Pope Paul, and then also having met the Ayatollah. Um, what have you learned from all that? Because you strike me as a very I don't know if you are, but you strike me as a very secular person. What have you learned from covering religion, though?
Well, I first of all, I think that nothing in science or in logic goes against the Bible. I mean, I find that the question is how you interpret it. And I covered the Middle East for 5 years, based out of Cairo, but I went to all the Arab countries and I spent quite a bit of time in Iran. And what I found was that people were locked in a downward spiral, because somebody would do something to somebody else. That person would take revenge, was doing even more to the original person that happened. And it was a system of constant vendettas. So whether Jesus was God or not is irrelevant, because what Jesus said is, I have a message. And it's the message that matters, not the person. And his message was that the way out of this constant turmoil, this constant strife and everything, is to both to understand each other, but also not to strike back at somebody who does something bad against you. That doesn't mean you can't use force. Sometimes there's an evil force that has to be stopped, like Hitler, and you need force to stop him. But that force should only be used in an objective sense, not for emotional revenge, or as Donald Trump is using the Justice Department now to seek out his personal enemies and try to destroy them. That's the opposite of the way you should use force. And I found that Jesus, I mean, maybe he's God, maybe he's not. It didn't matter. The question that mattered was to stop this violence. And the only way to stop the violence is to leave vengeance to God. Just forget about it. The person did something terrible to you. You just do not do something terrible back to
I'm
them. And in a
curious.
sense,
Mhm.
yeah.
Go on.
No, I was going to say, in a sense, that Bibi Netanyahu, the October 7th attack against Israel was a setup, because Sinwar, who was head of Hamas, had been in an Israeli jail for 20 years. He taught himself Hebrew. So he understood the Israeli mentality perfectly. So that attack on October 7th was intended to have Netanyahu bomb Gaza, kill 50,000 people, and seeking revenge, basically. And Sinwar knew that would destroy Israel, and it's what Jesus knew also.
That's a good segue into something I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that I think a lot of people, especially younger people, are very happy with Pope Francis about is he was very caring of what is happening to Palestinians in Gaza. And it wasn't in this political way. I mean, he would call the Holy Family Church, which I believe is the only Catholic parish in the Gaza Strip, almost every night to his death. Um, what do you make of that? I mean, do we have something to learn about how we could deal with the Middle East from Pope Francis?
Well, not only Pope Francis, but many friends I have who are Jewish are also concerned about what's happening to Palestinians.
Definitely, yeah.
You don't, yeah, you don't avenge what a thousand deaths by killing 50,000 people. And especially if they're women and children and they had nothing to do with what happened. So what Sinwar did, I mean, I think Sinwar did a deal with the devil. There's no question. He said, well, we're going to die, so we'll take everybody with us. We'll destroy civilization. There is no question. This was he wanted to be as horrible as possible, but the reaction to that cannot be as horrible as possible. And that's where Netanyahu lost himself. And when you live in the area, I lived in the area for like I said, 5 years. I was intimately involved in all of these countries and everything. You realize that there are many tribes besides the Jews and the Palestinians in the area, and all those tribes tell the same stories. They all talk about the flood. They all talk about the Tower of Babel and everything, but they interpret what the story meant differently. And the question is to find out which interpretation is going to get you out of the violence and save yourself. And I argued about this with one of the leading ayatollahs. In fact, it was with Sheikh Fadlallah, who was the spiritual leader of Hezbollah at the time. And he had wanted to meet outside of Damascus, so we met in private, And I said, if you continue trying to get revenge, it can only lead downhill to this spiral into destruction. And he said,
An eye
well,
for an eye would make the whole world blind.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Hammurabi's law of an eye for an eye. And Fadlallah said, well, he said, we Muslims are not weak like you Christians and Jews. And he said, we believe if somebody does something to us, we do something back to them, which is Hammurabi's law. But as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye leaves a country, leaves a world that's blind. And it inevitably goes downhill, but you can't convince people of that. And not only that, but if somebody preaches as Jesus did, they crucify. So it's not just Jesus, but I mean, I'm living in Philadelphia right now. We have the Amish. The Amish were attacked. They came out of Germany. They were attacked because they were against war. The Quakers were jailed in England because they were against killing people. And so what is it about human beings that says that to refuse to kill another human being is a crime? And but we've been fighting this for 2,000 years.
I'm curious, since you mentioned that conversation where I forget who it was you said, but he said that, well, Islam is different than Christianity or
Well,
the
it was
Christian.
Ayatollah Fazlallah,
Do you
and
think
he.
would you agree that that's only like one interpretation though of Islam?
Oh, sure. There are 10,000 interpretations. I mean, I lived in. I was a bureau chief for Southeast Asia for time, and I lived in Vietnam for 6 years during the war and everything. So we had what we call tropical Islam, which was relaxed. You had beautiful girls, and you could drink beer. And there are a lot of different ways of looking at the Islamic faith or interpreting it.
No, I mention it because
And
that's another thing that like really concerns me right now is just Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in America right now. I think both are very high, and I feel like figures like Pope Francis sort of believed more in maybe interfaith dialogue, and we probably need more of that.
well, I think that there's a piece in the Washington Post today about how Trump is collapsing because of the bubble alternate reality that was created. But it's basically Fox News. And what the piece points out is that Fox News took all the prejudices of kind of redneck flyover country and everything, and exacerbated. They said, "You're right. We'll repeat the prejudices. We'll repeat all of these basic ignorance, and everything." And people love it because it reaffirms what they believe instinctively inside. but it sets them off in a false direction where and that alternate reality is in the end it will collapse of its own fate. I mean, Hitler said he was going to make Germany into the master race, you know, but in the end, he was driven to destroy it. And Donald Trump says, "Oh, we want to make America for Americans." Who are Americans? I mean, an American is Black, an American is Hispanic, American is Korean, Cambodian. Yet I have more Vietnamese living around me in Philadelphia than I had in Saigon. And and they're all Americans. And I remember I took a taxi once in New York, and the taxi driver was from Haiti. So I speak French since I lived in France for a long time. So we were talking in French. And suddenly a van cut the taxi off, you know, and the taxi driver leaned out the window and he leaned out the window and he said, "You're not in India now, you're in the United States and you're in America." And I thought, you know, great. We are a country of everyone. And every time America has to deal with something in a foreign country, we've got people who are ethnically part of that country who are solidly American, who can speak for us. That's a strength that goes beyond anything. And so, why are we grabbing people off the street with, policemen wearing ski masks because they don't want somebody to recognize them, and sending them off to some prison to die in Central America? This is insane. It's not just not Christian, it's not American. And my 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 family settled in Virginia in 1714. They were refugees from the Civil War in England at the time. And we've been here for more than 200 years. And I have a commitment to this country. And I to see somebody take it and try to turn it into some kind of Nazi football game is just as disheartening, and it's terrible. I mean, it's basically evil. And I'm not religious, but I think that in a sense, religion is a metaphor for qualities that are in the human soul. And there's a delight on the part of the government to be cruel, to hurt people, to break families, to in this group that is really it defies imagination. I can't imagine where it came from. It certainly is not American. And I think the fact that now, as people are gradually becoming aware of what's happening, the polls are showing that Trump is in the toilet right now, and it's not going to get any better. And it's a question of, I mean, I'm a journalist still, obviously. So the question is, do you dare to speak up? And with the State Department in New York University, I talked briefly there. I was on different training programs for journalists in Armenia, Romania, different countries, and everything. And so later on, a editor, a young girl, she was in her 20s, but she's a journalist from Kazakhstan. She came to NYU, so I saw her at NYU, and she said, well, the authorities didn't like her, so they cut off the head of a dog and nailed it to her door as a message. And I said, well, why are you still a journalist? And she said, it's because what I do. And I was in Indonesia. I talked to the editor of Tempo, which is a Indonesian copy of Time magazine, And he said one of his reporters was hysterical. And he said, what happened? And the reporter said, well, I received a cardboard box and I opened it and there was a human head inside. And so the editor said, don't worry. He said, send the box over to me. So he said, I took the box down to the police department and said, I guess you misplaced this. And these people are not afraid of anything. now. And I've seen people in Iran who are not afraid of the theocratic government there now. But I see Americans who, a Republican Congress that will not stand up when it sees evil being committed around it. And I see Democratic senators and congressmen who won't speak out. I see journalists who say, oh, I guess the government might act against me if I said something. I see Jeff Bezos. Amazon said, we're going to print next to the cost of everything how much that cost was increased by tariffs. And then the White House said, you can't do that. That's political because you're going to argue against tariffs. So you can't do it. So Bezos backs down. And I see cowardice here everywhere. How can you be a coward like that and be an American? It's not American. We fought a war against Hitler. How can we become Nazis ourselves? It defies imagination.
I know you have to get going, but we'll have to continue this conversation at another point because I think we could have a longer form conversation just about where America is at. I don't know if you'd be interested in doing that maybe sometime over the summer, but I really want to thank you and maybe give you the last word on Pope Francis and just your closing thoughts on that subject.
Well, I think he was a decent, humble man, and I think that he tried to take the church where it was with Jesus. And I think he deserves credit for that. And I think that people loved him for that, particularly the younger generation. And so I think he lived well, he died well.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.